But you know us, we tend to always look at the other side because it's more interesting. Um, and so I want to start off today, Bobby, by talking about what's plaguing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who um, are definitely one of the more disappointing teams in the league to this point. They're not completely out of position. They're only in 11th place right now. They're 5 games under 500. They've lost 6 games in a row. And this is kind of the lowest point because on Saturday they lost at home to the Detroit Pistons. Anytime the Pistons beat you, it's not good, especially when you're at home. With their 6th straight loss. And look, they have been without Karl Towns for the last 16 games. They're 6-10 in that stretch. Recently, Rudy Gobert has been out of the lineup a little bit with illness. And so some of these games, they've been relatively shorthanded. They've had some other guys who have been out for long stretches, Taurean Prince, Jordan McLaughlin, who is their backup point guard, but is a key player for them. So I want to be clear before we talk about this. They are definitely have dealt with injuries, but there is a lot, affecting this team right now. Their competitive, I don't know what you want to call it, Bobby, their competitiveness has definitely been questioned, especially in the second half of some games, especially in the second half of that loss against the Pistons. They had a players only meeting for about a half hour afterwards, although some guys tried to deny it and say, we talk after every game. Okay. Chris Finch, their head coach, is kind of exasperated. I was with them about 2.5 weeks ago and he was exasperated then. And that was really before things went from bad to worse. And of course, everything about the Wolves this year centers around the Gobert trade. And as the Jazz have played well, although they've come back to earth and had a couple of close losses in this last couple of weeks, and they're now under 500. As the guys that they traded there, like Malik Beasley and Jared Vanderbilt and Walker Kessler, who is definitely a serious candidate for all rookie, I would say, especially as a defensive player. He's looking great defensively. The type of player they wanted to get, for Gobert, that they were trying to get when they traded Gobert, plus all the picks. Bobby, it's just been a tough situation in Minnesota. And Tim Connolly, the general manager, has been a bit of a pinata during the stretch for the Wolves fans. You've obviously been on the other side of this where you've made big trades. It's the stressful time there for them right now.
Oh, I mean, they went all in, right? So when you swing for the fence and you go all in, like we said, this past offseason with the Gobert trade, like you only have really one chance at getting it right. The jury is still out. I mean, they were 10-11 with Towns in a lineup before he got hurt. As you mentioned, they're 6-10. I think the concerning point for me is their point differential in the second half is -12. I mean, that in the last 6 games during this 6-game losing streak here.
That's the average.
That's the average.
Yeah.
That's the average. They were non-competitive in the second half to Detroit. Brian, their bench was outscored 65-20 in the Detroit loss. So that's, you had lost to Miami in that stretch. You didn't play Gobert down the stretch. You played Naz Reid instead. I thought they're probably their best game in the last couple of weeks was the loss to New Orleans. You lost by a point, which was a tremendous game. I mean, that was the Zion taking over. I guess we call it football or basketball or one or the other. But
yeah, that was so funny because, earlier this year, the Pelicans were just exasperated by the lack of calls. And David Griffin, I think, said something, and TJ McCollum said something. And they were like, we can't get a call. And now you've got, the Wolves in that game, which was, a moral victory, I guess, considering all the guys who are out, complaining that Zion gets all the calls and that he's bowling people over and not getting called. Just a classic ref complaint situation in the NBA. But go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, almost 40 games in, and I still don't think, even though there's been injuries, we don't know what their identity is. Last year, their identities, they ranked think 7th in offensive efficiency, tops in 3-point makes, attempts. I think top 10 in percentage. This year they're trending kind of towards the bottom. The guys they signed in the offseason, Kyle Anderson's been hurt. Bryn Forbes has been getting DMPs, Austin Rivers, some of those minimum guys here. As you mentioned, Torian Prince has been hurt. Cat certainly. Now you're relying on a bench that is below average. I think it's going to be interesting here going forward. So they had this players only meeting after the Detroit loss. Chris Finch came out and said, basically, like, I'm going to just start playing guys who I think should be on the court. I think you're going to what you'll see is you'll probably see more of like Wendell Moore, their first round pick out of Duke, and Josh Minot, who they drafted out of Memphis. Like, I think you're going to see a little bit of their younger players. They've got Denver, Portland, and the Clippers. Those are their next 3 games, all at home. But you're right. I mean, they're 16-21, but they're, what are they, a half game out of 10? Between them, the Lakers, I think probably OKC. Those are the 3 teams that are jockeying there. But here's the question, as you know, like, who in that top 10 is going to fall out? Is it going to be Utah? That would probably be the lone team here. So I just don't know what their identity here. I would have loved, I'd love to have Karl Anthony Towns in the lineup for 35, 40 games, and we can probably make a better assumption. But without him here, I mean, they have to be, either making shots or getting stops, and they haven't been able to do either.
Well, yeah, that was their style of play last year. Their style of play was high tempo, high scoring, high volume threes, run and gun. It's one of the reasons why that series that they played with Memphis was so entertaining. It was because they played kind of this wild style. And Tim Connolly, and by the way, it wasn't just Tim Connolly. Their Mark Laurie, who's their incoming owner, I believe he has to buy a piece of the, another tranche of the team this year. And then I think can buy the rest at the end of next year. I guess it's this year now, 2023. But he's influencing policy already. He wanted that trade too. It wasn't just Tim Connolly. From what I understand, he was a driving force in that trade too. But one of the reasons why they wanted to do that is they wanted to clean up the areas that they, saw that they didn't think that the way that team played was going to get them to the next level. Now, it was really enjoyable for the fans. It's a organization that has really done everything they possibly can to drive away their fans for the last 15 years, whether it's losing franchise players, to demanding trades from Garnett to Kevin Love. Wiggins then didn't work out. He was considered a franchise player at one point. The Thibodeau thing was a tease, and then Jimmy Butler wanted out. I mean, like, there's been this long stretch where those fans have been bashed over the head with very little to celebrate, and then they finally had a team to celebrate. And I think it was a responsible concept by Tim Connolly and the ownership to say, okay, well, let's take the next step. And they just paid so much for it that they really made their margin for error small. Now, what I'd say is they didn't invest in Gobert for 1 year. Like, they saw this as a multi-year play. Quite frankly, Chris Finch, I was there in the preseason. I talked to him about it. And, I really like Chris Finch because he's frank. And he said, look, people look at what Gobert and Donovan Mitchell were in Utah and they go, well, they never made it to the finals, or they got eliminated in the playoffs. He was like, they made it to the playoffs 6 straight years with the number 1 overall seed, had a great chance. Several years had, if things had fallen differently, they could have been in the conference finals or finals. He's like, if we got a 6-year run like that with this group, we would be thrilled, and we would see whether we could maybe maximize a little bit more. They knew that Gobert had limitations. They didn't expect him to walk in and everything to be perfect. They knew it was going to take some time, but he has really, I think, really frustrated the fans there and frustrated his teammates, because earlier this season, he kept having turnovers. They would run plays, pick and rolls for him, and the ball would go through his hands. And I don't have the number in front of me to tell you how many of those turnovers he had, but for the Wolves and their fans, it felt like 100. and there was some frustration there. And then his defense was good, but like wasn't like game changing like they thought. And then the injuries came in. And look, their best player. I mean, you can debate about whether Ant Edwards is their best player, but their best player is really Karl Towns. That's the guy they gave the $200 million contract to. He's barely played. He came in late because he got the illness in the preseason, and it totally wrecked his preseason. He lost a bunch of weight, and now he had the calf injury, which frankly looked like it could have been a lot worse. Bobby, I don't think they really have much of an option here other than to wait and hope that they are able to patch it together. This is what Gobert has been preaching. Gobert has been preaching patience, patience, patience. But the natives are getting restless there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fans are getting restless because they saw what happened the year they made the playoffs with Tibbs, and then all hell broke loose the following year with the Jimmy Butler situation. And now they felt that they were, you lose to Memphis in a great series here, that they were one player away. And like I've been there, like, when we made that big Boston trade of way back when, like we lost to Chicago and we thought we were one player away to compete with Miami. Right. And when you do something like that, if you don't get it right, it, will haunt you for a long, long time here. And how this roster is built, I mean, they're going to be faced with a decision with Anthony Edwards this summer. They're going to essentially have probably 3 max players here, and not have a choice about it. And Gobert's got 3 more years. Towns, the supermax hasn't kicked in yet. You're stripped of your draft assets. It's not like this is a situation like Chicago or some of these other teams where we say, well, now we got to pivot here, right? Like it's hard to pivot right now because Gobert is his trade value is not there. Towns can't be traded, and you're basically looking at some of your smaller pieces. I guess D'Angelo Russell's contract is one of your bigger pieces, but what is the value of him on an expiring contract in a point guard heavy league here? That's the hard part here, is that you're basically, the next thing would be is you just fire the coach, right? But Brian, I mean, like that's how we always see it. Like maybe not now, but you go into the offseason and be like, well, maybe it's somebody else that can, shape this roster differently than how Chris Finch is. But you wrote the great piece before the season started. Like, Chris was involved in the decision making.
He was
he
was totally for it. Unless he was doing a great acting job on me, he was totally for it.
Yeah, which is different than when we went through with Jason Kidd back in 2000. I guess it was 2013. Like Jason hadn't coached a game yet. So like we really didn't even know what kind of style he was going to play. Like, so when you get all these, the Pearson Garnetts and the Jason Terrys and Kirilenko and those guys here, like you're just hoping it works out. Like you already know what kind of, what the input that Chris is willing to or how he's willing to change from a year ago and how Rudy's going to be involved. But I mean, you just look at their trade assets as far as what they can't trade, which is their first round picks. They only got 3 seconds, Brian. I mean, that's it. They can move in a deal. And they've got they've got a lot of guys on minimum contracts. You got Taurean Prince's, I just don't see the value in there unless your bench, right? Like your bench, you're asking the Austin Rivers of the world to play 25 minutes, guy who signed a partially guaranteed contract. So that's what hurts, is when you have Jordan McLaughlin, you mentioned, that are out. You're asking for your 13th, 14th, the back end of the guys to play, either start or play significant roles.
So the D'Angelo Russell situation is interesting. He is making like third last year of his, or is he 28 million? It's around 30. He's in the last year of his contract. They really seem to be struggling at times this year with getting consistent point guard play. And, they kind of need a veteran leader. Not that D'Angelo Russell isn't that, but like I said that they could use a guy like Mike Conley. It doesn't appear Mike Conley is available, at least right now. But if they've got to pay all of these salaries and they've got to kick Ant Edwards up to a max, which is what he's going, can they afford to trade Russell for somebody with a lot of money on his contract, even if sort of upgrading. So like one player, I'll just say this as a hypothetical, underline hypothetical here. One player that I have thought about would be, could they call Miami and get Kyle Lowry? Because he's a type of veteran guy who I think would really help them. And I think that the Heat might be interested in getting out from that contract. This is a hypothetical. Do we all understand that? Thank you. But that would be adding a whole bunch of money to their books. I don't know if they're in position to do that with where their salaries are, Bobby. And I'm not, but I'm also not sure that they're going to re-sign Russell unless he takes a significant pay cut. And that was going to be a challenge before this year. Even if everything was going well, that was going to be a challenge. So I don't know. Like, they genuinely miss Patrick Beverley. Not that Beverley is the prototypical floor general, but they miss what he brought to them. They need a veteran lead guard like that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was texting with a team before I jumped on here, and I was just picking a brain about Minnesota, and one of the things they said was like, who on this team is kind of willing to get their hands dirty? Who's kind of the little bit of the enforcer here? That when things, who's the one who can deal with adversity here? I think your Miami point, the hypothetical that you mentioned, that's kind of the direction that you have to look at, because the Edwards extension doesn't kick in until 24, 25. So you have a little bit of a 1 year window where you can take on salary. You only have $120 million committed for next year. The luxury tax is 164. So, by taking on Kyle's number or a player like that, you can still do that and stay under the tax. And I'm sure if you're Miami, you would be like, hey, we want to maybe pay Gabe Vincent or Max Strus or one of these guys who are going to be free agents again, upcoming unrestricted free agent. So that's the type of deals that you're going, because you're not going to pay D'Angelo Russell $31 million again, like to be your fourth or fifth best player when you're already committing big money here. And this free agent class, let's face it, coming up, if you're Minnesota, you lose D'Angelo, you're basically looking at, mid-level exception type money here in an average free agent class. So that's the direction that if you're the Timberwolves, that you would want to go in here, is where, hey, we're willing to take on salary, but it can't be salary that extends past the 23-24 season.
Well, that's why Conley and Lowry both fit into that situation. I'm not sure where that would be. Like, I don't know how the Heat would view Russell fitting into their operation in a year where, they're underperforming, but they still have high hopes. And so, but that, I think Minnesota was already, going to have some big questions in front of them even before this. But I would just say that my general feel on Minnesota is, as bad as it looks right now, I think you got to take Gobert's advice and you just got to wait. You got to wait for Towns to come back. You got to wait for them to try to settle down a little bit, try to, like you said, find that style of play. But it's gotten kind of ugly there, and they're taking fire right now. So we'll see how that goes. One thing I don't think is going to happen is I don't think D'Angelo Russell is going to sign an extension. He is extension eligible.
One of 29.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN Plus.